In fact, our greatest modern discoveries, scientific discoveries, are rooted in this period. I mean, think about what you probably learned in elementary school, the scientific method. What I remember sitting in those classes is that we must observe and then we hypothesize, we test the hypothesis, we analyze, and we draw conclusions. All that is rooted back to this period. Yet, today, in 2020, I think we find ourselves struggling with Enlightenment principles. It feels to me like we're fighting the Enlightenment all over again. We dismiss facts that we don't like, and sometimes we characterize knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge as being elitist. For example, Science Magazine reports that regardless of scientific consensus, so regardless of the facts, regardless of the data, people across the ideological spectrum object to public policy on everything from the regulation of nuclear power and childhood vaccination to climate change and the regulation of coal production. This summer, and some of you may remember this, a high ranking public official said when she was discussing COVID-19 and whether or not we were going to reopen our public schools, quote, "The science should not stand in the way of this." Think about that. The science should not stand in the way of this. That those facts, that data shouldn't get in the way of the decision that we want to make. Here, science and facts are part of a zero-sum game that we're in conflict with a government decision. So what does a well-informed public do with facts when their government chooses to ignore them? So how well equipped are we to do this today? Well, there was a study done in 2010 that shows that there are more Americans who are able to identify Michael Jackson as the composer of some songs than who know that there are 10 amendments that are part of the Bill of Rights. When asked what century the American Revolution took place and whether the Civil War, the War of 1812, and the Emancipation Proclamation preceded or came after the Revolution, more than 30% of respondents answered the question incorrectly. And more than a third of Americans didn't know that the Bill of Rights included and guaranteed a right to trial by jury, but mistakenly believed that the Bill of Rights included the right to vote. Now, things didn't get much better a few years later. In 2015, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni did a study, and more than 80% of seniors at high-ranking colleges and universities, top-ranked institutions, would have received a grade of D or F on the survey that was done. And just think about this. And those of you in this room who are matriculating at BYU, think about this. Roughly half of the students couldn't tell this organization the length of the term of a senator or a representative in the United States Congress. It is hard, it is virtually impossible to hold elected officials accountable if you don't understand civics, if you don't understand how our country works. Collins and his team's survey of the genome forever changed the way that diseases are studied and diagnosed and treated and prevented. And some would say that he knows better than almost anyone how some scientists, armed with research that informs who we are as human beings, believe that faith is irrelevant. In fact, Dr. Collins, who grew up in the church, was an atheist until he was 27 years old. And then at that time, he was serving as a resident in a North Carolina hospital. And he had spent quite a bit of time with the patient, sitting with that patient day after day, until finally one day the patient looked at him and said, "You know, I've told you a lot about me. I told you what I believe, but you haven't told me anything about what you believe." That was the beginning of the end of Dr. Collins's atheism. What he did from that moment was to, at first, set about looking for ways to prove the patient wrong. He had a conversation with a Methodist pastor, and it was his intention in that conversation to gather the information he could so that he could validate his atheist beliefs. Instead, the pastor introduced Dr. Collins to the book Mere Christianity, authored by the Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis. And in reading that book, Dr. Collins was convinced that a close examination of the facts would lead one to believe that it is more rational to choose to believe and a better choice to choose to believe than not to believe. Based on his own journey from atheism to Christianity, Dr. Collins founded the organization Biologos, which has as its mission to show that science and faith are not in conflict with one another.